extremist rhetoric online, rising political tensions, and the proliferation on January 6th that brought us to a boiling point. The attack on the Capitol of it in the last few years, the warnings we've received from law enforcement and intelligence leaders imposed by violent domestic groups since. In Charlottesville in 2017, in my own district, Lansing, and 2020, and tragically right now on January 6th in the nation's capital. And the attack on the Capitol on the 6th, and the warnings we received from law enforcement and intelligence leaders in the months leading up to right now will lead them to climb that ladder of escalation, that while external threats use violence or the threat of violence for political goals to our country right now domestic the threat of domestic terrorism. Taking on this threat is our top priority. This is why our first hearing for some people, the division after the attack rife in our country right now was focused on domestic terrorism. That ladder and why today's hearing, the first violence or the threat of violence for political goals and it becomes domestic terrorism. We'll continue that critical discussion. Taking on this threat is as a former CIA analyst, why I wanted hearing as to make sure we're all on the month after the attack on January 6th and scale was focused on domestic terrorism. And the words and why today's hearing, the first subcommittee hearings for the Homeland Security Committee. A week ago today, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Ali Mayorkas, testified in front of our former CIA analyst. I wanted to take a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. The greatest threat in the homeland and scale of these threats. The threat isn't going away. A few weeks ago, FBI Director Wray testified that domestic terrorism investigations. A week ago today, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Ali Mayorkas, testified in front of our full committee after the domestic violent extremism represents. And Director Wray testified in front of our committee last Congress that we now have more open investigations FBI Director Wray domestic extremism, domestic terrorism investigations cases grown from individuals 1,000 in September to about 2,000 after the Director of National Intelligence in collaboration with Justice and Director Wray testified in front of our committee last an assessment we now have more domestic violent extremists pose around domestic extremism than we do this assessment cautions of individuals connected to foreign to be radicalized and will mobilize around narratives of election the Director of National Intelligence in collaboration with Justice and Homeland Security and released an assessment warning the domestic violent extremists laid out an elevated terminology that our intelligence and law enforcement assessment cautions that extremists will continue to be radicalized and will mobilize around narratives. The intelligence community's foremost concern is, quote, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. The threat assessment also laid out important terminology that our intelligence and law enforcement officers use to describe these threats, and it's important that we get on the same page. The intelligence community's foremost concern is, quote, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, RMVEs, as well as, quote, militia violent extremists, MVEs. Our intelligence agencies have assessed that these groups pose at present the most lethal domestic threat. Racially motivated extremists are the most likely to conduct mass casualty attacks against civilians, and militias are likely to target law enforcement and government personnel and facilities. The agency's assessments notes that the threat is compounded by tech platforms that make radicalization, recruitment, and mobilization easier. As we sit here today, we are facing a new reality. The post 9/11 era of security where the threats come from abroad is over. In the 20 years of the post 9/11 era, they came to an end on January 6th. The new reality is that we have to come to terms with is that it's our extremists here at home seeking to exploit internal divisions that pose the greatest threat. This is why we're focusing on these challenges today in this hearing. The issue is not theoretical for me and others who are on this screen. In my own district last year, federal and state authorities managed to disrupt a plot by at least 14 men to kidnap and kill our governor, Gretchen Whitmer. The group spied on the governor's vacation home, conducted firearms and combat training, and practiced building explosives. They planned to detonate a bomb under a highway bridge to distract local authorities as they kidnapped our governor to relocate her to Wisconsin for a, quote, trial. These plotters weren't affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. They didn't hail from war-torn regions halfway around the world. They were Americans. And they were radicalized right here at home. These men were affiliated with a group called the Wolverine Watchmen, a violent extremist group threatening to start a civil war here in the United States. And even just this week, another 22-year-old man from my district who was affiliated with this group was charged with 2 felony counts related to modifying a semi-automatic weapon. This is exactly what the FBI and DHS have been sounding the alarm over. In this moment, groups like this that are the ones that pose the greatest threat to our safety and our way of life. I am very, very grateful for the work of law enforcement at both the state and federal level who disrupted this terrible plot. Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, who is here with us today, has led the majority of the charges against these defendants. And she has charged these 8 of the extremists with, quote, providing material support for terrorist acts. And 2 of the 8 were additionally charged by her office with the, quote, threat of terrorism. AG Nessel's work highlights the very reason we have called this hearing. It lays out, today we'll hear about the patchwork of state and local and federal laws that we have to prosecute violent extremists. As many of you know, although domestic terrorism is defined in federal law, there are no specific federal domestic terrorism charges. And while some of these investigations may result in, some investigations do result in serious charges, such as hate crimes and gun charges. And in the case of January 6th, we've had perpetrators charged with conspiracy and sedition. Many of these domestic terrorism related investigations will not progress as terrorism related charges. This is a major reason why we're here today, as I said, to understand the legal authorities we do and do not have to prosecute domestic terrorists, and in particular, to understand whether federal legislation is or is not needed to tackle these threats. In the meantime, states have tried to devise their own systems for countering domestic terrorism and hate-fueled violence, but those approaches differ. And in states like Michigan and Texas, for example, those differences can be significant. So today's hearing will allow us to hear from law enforcement leaders in 3 states about how they're working to combat these threats and the legal tools they have and don't have at their disposal. We will also, in the subcommittee, examine how states coordinate federal government with the federal government to combat the threat, and how the federal government can better complement state and local communities' efforts. Our state and local law enforcement, our attorneys general, are on the front lines of this fight, and it's great that we have them here today to speak directly to the public on this. I will just say, so one of the things that I'm personally looking at is some legislation to ensure that DHS has the tools that they need from an intelligence analysis perspective to better understand these threats. One of the things we know is we just don't do a ton of data collection. We just don't understand the magnitude of the threat. And I hope this is an area where myself and the other side of the aisle can work to improve the Department of Homeland Security's capabilities. In addition to our witnesses, I just want to take a brief moment to thank the attorneys general from District of Columbia and Oregon and the National District Attorneys Association for their work on this topic, and note that some statements they have submitted for the record. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today about where we can improve and where we can, follow through with that guarantee of safety to every American. I know that we want to set a strong tone, a bipartisan tone, and here in this subcommittee. With that, I thank the witnesses for being here, and I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for an opening statement.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for your commitment to work in a bipartisan way on a topic that's very important to all Americans. I appreciate that commitment to work across the aisle and to make sure that we assess this space in a threat-based, fact-based way. As we saw in our first official briefing as a subcommittee a couple of weeks ago, sometimes getting the straight answers from agencies can be tough, and it's incumbent upon all of us to ask those hard questions and to get to the root of any sort of violence that is affecting our country. Violent extremism in any form is unacceptable. In addition to the recent attacks on the Capitol, we've seen over the summer attacks on federal buildings throughout the country, and whether it's far left groups or far right groups, including a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, it is completely unacceptable in this country to live or have a threat of fear, which is what terrorism, foreign or domestic, would have us do. Many of these violent threats are being driven by rampant disinformation and misinformation online, and they have left federal, state, and local authorities with new unprecedented challenges on dealing with this. And all of this has led to worthwhile discussions and debates around the merits of whether new criminal statutes are needed to combat domestic terrorism. But at the end of the day, it is so important that we protect our First Amendment while keeping our citizens safe. In the wake of the attacks on 9/11, Washington did pass many laws that impacted our national security and still do to this day. I think that our country has benefited from those greatly, but I also want to make sure that if some of those were done in a knee-jerk way, that we also take a very thoughtful and measured approach at this point in time, and that we consider the effects that may not be immediate but could be far-reaching in the future. And I know that we have had many of those conversations to assess that. Today, I hope to hear from a panel of witnesses their views on their own state domestic terror laws, as well as the efficacy of existing federal criminal offenses that are used in domestic terror cases. I hope that we will be able to understand the Department of Homeland Security's Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program to see how effective and whether the program is working, and if not, how we can make that better to combat our terror threats within the country. It's incumbent upon those of us on this subcommittee to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security is doing everything in their power to protect American citizens across the range of threats in this country that we are facing right now. And I know and agree with everything that you said, that our officers, CBP officers and otherwise throughout the Department of Homeland Security are on the front lines and are doing everything that they possibly can. And I salute those officers and personnel who are willing to risk their lives for American citizens every single day. We look forward to working with the state and local authorities. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses that are here, those that we have also talked to in the past week, to get a better understanding of what we need to do to make sure that we do protect American life. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and appreciate the willingness of them to join. With that, Madam Chair, thank you for your leadership and your commitment to working in a bipartisan way to keep Americans safe. I yield back at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, a former criminal prosecutor and civil rights attorney. Attorney General Nessel was sworn in as Michigan's 54th Attorney General in January of 2019. As Michigan's chief law enforcement officer, Attorney General Nessel oversees one of the most robust state terrorism statutes in the nation. Our second witness is Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford. Before serving as the AG for Nevada, AG Ford served as the majority leader of the Nevada State Senate. In 2019, Mr. Ford sponsored new legislation aimed at countering sovereign citizens, an anti-government extremist movement, particularly in Nevada, by prohibiting the creation of fake judicial documents, which is a common tactic for adherents of this movement. Our third and final witness is Milwaukee County District Attorney John Chisholm. District Attorney Chisholm's office handles criminal cases for the state of Wisconsin in the Milwaukee County Circuit Court. DA Chisholm led Milwaukee County's response to the 2012 white supremacist terrorist attack on a Sikh temple in Oak Tree, Wisconsin. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Attorney General Nessel. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. Again, my name is Dana Nessel, and I am the Attorney General and Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the great state of Michigan. I'm honored to be with you this morning, and I share in your commitment to explore ways that we can better confront and combat issues related to domestic terrorism. And it is my firm belief that this growing threat is one of the most serious national security issues we face, and that it must be addressed in a bipartisan manner with local, state, and federal agencies partnering together to ensure that this country and our democracy is defended against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Now, Michigan is no stranger to the threat of domestic terrorism, and in many ways, my state has served as ground zero for anti-government militia extremism since the 1990s, when it was discovered that the Michigan militia had ties to Oklahoma City bombers Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. And though it has been more than 25 years since the Oklahoma City bombing, acts of domestic terrorism still tear at the very fabric of this country. And just last year, my office, as you noted, charged 8 leaders and associates of the anti-government extremist militia Wolverine Watchmen with supporting a terrorist plot to kidnap and kill the governor of our state, to hold members of our state legislature hostage in our state capitol for days before ultimately destroying it, and planning to harm law enforcement officers who protect and serve our state residents. The U.S. Attorney's Office charged another 6 individuals stemming from the same investigation. In addition, Michigan has recently seen a deluge of threats to legislators, judges, and other government officials on both sides of the political aisle. In just the past 6 months, we have issued charges against individuals in 5 separate cases for threatening public officials, and that is honestly just the tip of the iceberg. We've been asked to review so many cases that my department had to establish a special procedure for complaint intake and add additional prosecutorial resources to handle complaint review. Though the factual nature of the claims may be different, my experience in Michigan has demonstrated that acts of domestic terrorism are not focused on one political party or even one branch of government, and the threat they present is ever rising. Moreover, anti-government militia extremism and racially motivated violent extremism is not unique to Michigan. FBI Director Christopher Wray has acknowledged in testimony before the Senate earlier this month that far right-wing extremists are the most significant terrorist threat facing the United States. And in his testimony, he stated that at any given time, the FBI has approximately 2,000 domestic terrorism investigations, and he has repeatedly warned of the mounting domestic terror threat in recent years. He's acknowledged that racially motivated violent extremists are also one of the most significant domestic terrorism threats. And of these, the most lethal attacks over the last few years have involved white supremacists. So in light of this serious and growing threat, I have expanded my department's hate crimes unit to now include domestic terrorism because of the overlap of extremist ideologies. And I have also directed my department to work with the FBI and the Michigan State Police and to prioritize these cases for prosecutorial review. Now, luckily, Michigan is uniquely situated to address domestic terrorism because of the Michigan Anti-Terrorism Act. And this act went into effect with bipartisan support in April of 2002 following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Our legislature recognized that laws should be enacted to adequately address the threats of terrorism against targets in our state. And these statutes criminalize domestic terrorism by providing state prosecutors with the tools necessary to prosecute as 20-year felonies the following: acts of domestic terrorism, providing material support or resources for terrorism, hindering prosecution of terrorism, communicating true or false threats of terrorism, disrupting telecommunications of public safety, education, or government operations, and obtaining blueprints or security diagrams for terrorists to vulnerable targets like school buildings, houses of religious worship, stadiums, and infrastructure. And in addition to the Michigan Anti-Terrorism Act, my office has utilized or could utilize Michigan gang statutes to charge individuals acting on behalf of a group, and statutes that criminalize the impersonation of a police officer and training with firearms and explosives in furtherance of civil disorder. Now, while Michigan has a robust array of laws to address domestic terrorism, many states and federal prosecutors do not. For example, while federal prosecutors have laws that address providing material support for designated foreign terrorist organizations, there are no laws to address domestic terrorists or homegrown violent extremists. And that is a gap my department has used our state laws to fill But to fully combat domestic terrorism across the country, changes to federal criminal laws must be made. Moreover, because we are on the front line of this battle, federal funding is needed for state law enforcement offices like mine so that we can dedicate staff and resources to this cause. And if states are doing the heavy lifting, they must be adequately resourced. Lastly, and importantly, I want to emphasize that terrorism is a messaging crime. Domestic terrorists seek to send a message of fear to intimidate and coerce the conduct of government. All government. Government must send its own message back by labeling extremist violence as domestic terrorism. Labels matter. Prosecuting hate-motivated attackers as terrorists sends the clear message that the threat of extremism is just as significant when it is based on domestic, political, religious, or social ideologies as it is when it's based on violent jihadism. We need bipartisan and aggressive solutions to the problem of domestic terrorism because acts of domestic terrorism don't just harm the target of the crime, they threaten the very foundation of our democracy. The January 6th Capitol riots sparked an important national conversation about the potential dangers of domestic terrorism, but confronting this threat requires more than just talk. It requires swift action. And for these reasons, I applaud this committee for taking this important step and starting this conversation. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you the actions that we are taking here in Michigan to address this growing crisis. And I stand ready to work with you in all ways possible to help fight terrorism within our borders, to keep our citizens safe, and to keep the wheels of our democracy turning. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Nessel, for your testimony. I now recognize Attorney General Ford to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger, who incidentally, I'm born and raised in Texas. I've been in Nevada for 20 years and have a lot of affinity for Texas with my family still being there, so I bring you greetings. And distinguished members of the subcommittee, including Sheila Jackson-Lee, who I've worked with in the past on several issues. My name is Aaron D. Ford, Attorney General for the state of Nevada, and I'd like to thank Congresswoman Slotkin for the opportunity to speak here. I'd like to also congratulate and to welcome my good colleague and friend, Attorney General Dana Nessel, who has unfortunately been on the front line of combating domestic terrorism, as well as Milwaukee County District Attorney John Chisholm, who has seen his unfair share of domestic terrorism taking place in his city as well. Thank you again for inviting me to this important conversation about ways that we can prevent and respond to domestic terrorism. Nevada is no stranger to violent acts. On October 1st, 2017, Las Vegas became the site of the deadliest mass shooting in our country's history. 60 innocent people were killed and nearly 1,000 injured, all who were simply trying to enjoy a music festival. This tragedy shook our community and terrified the nation. We all know too well the pain that our fellow Americans in Atlanta, Georgia, and Boulder, Colorado are feeling right now, and our hearts go out to those communities. As much as I would like to say that this was an isolated incident, we all know that that's not true. It is one of a handful of tragic events over the last decade. Nevada continues to grapple with domestic violence extremism, whether it be anti-government extremists who threaten or commit violence against the government, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists who target certain people, or extremists that utilize undefined ideologies to justify their violence. An incident in 2014 in Bunkerville, Nevada, involved an armed militia comprised of anti-government activists who confronted the Bureau of Land Management over a land dispute. They aimed loaded weapons at law enforcement in what came to be known as the Battle of Bunkerville. Not long after this incident, 2 Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers and a Good Samaritan were murdered in Las Vegas by anti-government extremists. Just last year, a Nevada Highway Patrol trooper was killed in the line of duty by an individual who demonstrated anti-government extremist tendencies. Currently, the Clark County District Attorney's Office and the United States Attorney for the District of Nevada are jointly prosecuting an attempted bombing planned by perpetrators associated with the Boogaloo Boys, which is a loosely organized far-right anti-government extremist movement. Terms such as domestic violence extremism and domestic terrorism do not always mean the same thing to everyone. In fact, the October 1, 2017 shooting was not considered an act of terrorism under federal law, presumably due to the lack of known political motivation and lack of international nexus. The perpetrator of this heinous crime was referred to as a, quote, lone wolf, unquote. The phrase lone wolf has been used to reference many culprits of mass violence who are usually white. Calling someone a lone wolf implies that they are not terrorists because they are not connected to a state sponsor of terrorism or other group organized around a political ideology. However, had the perpetrator of the 2017 mass shooting survived, he likely would have been charged as a terrorist under Nevada law. Nevada revised statutes defines acts of terrorism and creates criminal penalties for acts of terrorism or attempted acts of terrorism. This law was passed in the aftermath of 9/11, and it has proven to be a powerful tool for Nevada in charging terrorists. The Nevada terrorism statute does not require us to prove hate, political ideology, or other motivation. Nevada law defines terrorism as sabotage, coercion, or violence which is intended to, and I quote, cause great bodily harm or death to the general population, unquote, or substantial destruction, contamination, or impairment to a building, infrastructure, utilities, or natural resources. You may be familiar with, and you've recently heard the term sovereign citizens. These individuals do not recognize the authority of any government or our laws. The movement has also has racist and anti-Semitic ties, believing that certain racial and ethnic groups have taken over our government and financial institutions. The sovereign citizen movement is considered by the FBI as domestic terrorism extremism. Experts with the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center estimate that as many as 500 sovereign citizens reside here in Nevada, representing the largest domestic terrorism threat in our state. Sovereign citizens are responsible for the murders of Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officers that I referenced earlier in my testimony. A common tactic of sovereign citizens is to serve false legal documents such as summons, fines, or even arrest warrants on representatives of the government from their own made-up courts. Sovereign citizens often target law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges, as we are viewed as enforcing laws that they do not recognize. Even our broad definition of terrorism was not sufficient to address some of the common tactics of domestic terrorists. In 2019, I personally sponsored a bill in the Nevada State Legislature that criminalized simulated or fake legal documents purporting to be from false courts with the intent to harass or defraud someone. When testifying on the bill I sponsored, a detective with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department assigned to the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center stated that he and other officers received fake indictments and arrest warrants for treason, and the penalty for treason is death. The goal of this legislation was to crack down on this tactic used by sovereign citizens, whether the tactic is being used as part of a scam or used to target and threaten violence. One of the questions this subcommittee posed to us is whether, in light of January 6, 2021, of that attack on the Capitol, additional federal legislation is needed to combat domestic terrorism. So, in my opinion, does federal law need a refresh? To use a lawyer's term of art, it depends. There are no easy fixes in the fight against domestic terrorism. With the rise of domestic violent extremism, there is no question that something needs to change so that we can ensure public safety. I would recommend that we take a measured approach to enacting new laws regarding counterterrorism to include the protection of privacy, free speech, and the right to bear arms. It is important for us to assess and balance the rights of individuals with matters of security and safety. There are
Attorney General Ford, I'll just say, I'm sure we will get to it in questions. I want to make sure we have time to get to our next witness. I'm sorry to cut you off. I apologize, but I know people will be asking you questions about your last couple of comments there. With that, I'm going to turn and recognize Mr. Chisholm to summarize his statement in 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger, distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is John Chisholm. I am the District Attorney of Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, serving since 2007. For the 12 years preceding my election, I was an assistant district attorney in the same jurisdiction, specializing primarily in criminal prosecutions related to illegal firearm use and violence. As district attorney, I participated in our jurisdiction's response to acts of domestic violent extremism and in our preparations to forestall future attacks. I appear before you this morning in the hope that my experience as a local public safety policymaker may prove of use in your deliberations concerning one of the critical issues of our time, and that is the resurgence in the form of domestic extremism of political violence within American public life. What I believe is very simple. In order for our democracy to survive, we must maintain a steadfast commitment to maximizing individual liberty while restraining acts that harm the social compact. This means an absolute intolerance of unlawful violence without qualification, whether interpersonal or political. As a prosecutor, I've devoted my career to preventing and responding to acts of interpersonal violence and holding those perpetrators to account. The same vigor with which we investigate and prosecute interpersonal violence must be applied to our efforts to curb violent extremism in our country, regardless of the political spectrum it arises from. My experience in responding to acts of extremism dates to August 5th of 2012, when a white supremacist attacked the Sikh temple of Wisconsin here in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, killing 6 members of our Sikh community and severely wounding several others, including an Oak Creek police lieutenant. As recently as last year, a Sikh priest wounded in this attack died of the injuries he sustained that day. I responded in person to the scene that day with my investigative staff and with my victim services staff. I knew some of the people in that place of worship because prior to that day, the president of the Sikh temple, Satwat Singh Kalika, had invited me and other elected officials to share the Sikh faith's commitment to fully participating in civic life in our county and to address his concerns about the safety of the Sikh community. While the memory of the tragic suffering of our Sikh brothers and sisters that day will always remain fresh with me, what stands out the most in my mind is the bond that was forged in the shared sacrifice between the officers who responded that day and the incredible lesson in compassion, dignity, forgiveness displayed by the Sikh community and embraced by the larger Milwaukee community after the shooting. The role of the Department of Justice in facilitating that healing was significant. I intentionally refrained from naming the person who walked into a temple of worship and gunned down innocent people of peace. I think instead of the bravery of the people inside, how Lieutenant Murphy, as the first officer on scene, confronted in close combat the offender, was wounded 15 times, but stopped him long enough for a fellow officer to arrive and bring the rampage to an end. When the violence struck our jurisdiction, we responded using a toolbox that is often more readily accessible than it may appear. Our existing criminal intelligence infrastructure, historically used to combat illegal drug commerce and the violence associated with it, such as our Milwaukee high-intensity drug trafficking area. We also developed our Intelligence Fusion Center, a collaborative effort anchored at the Milwaukee Police Department, comprising personnel and resources from suburban jurisdictions, Milwaukee County agencies, and our federal and state partners. Over the years, this criminal intelligence infrastructure has supplemented resources dedicated exclusively to counterterrorism. This structure and its corresponding communication platforms allowed us to work on the ground to communicate real time to a dynamic threat. An additional consideration at the local level is that in the event of violence occasioned by political extremism, members of the public in jurisdictions of all sizes must have the reassurance that their local law enforcement agencies can serve as a reliable first line of defense. And always, we have to make sure that our public safety preparations, both in spirit and in practice, align with the express direction of the people we serve. One potential solution, taking all these factors into account, is to increase federal financial support for mutual aid compacts at the local and regional levels. These compacts can equip mobile response teams to respond to violent incidents in smaller neighboring communities with the signed consent of those communities' elected civilian leadership. Southeastern Wisconsin has experienced success with such a model in the form of a regional partnership called SMART, the Suburban Mutual Aid Response Team. In addition, there should be a robust discussion about the appropriate and restrained use of hate crime laws, both at the state and federal level. Most local jurisdictions operate under state laws designed to address substantive underlying offenses. We rarely address the motive behind a harmful act. We instead focus on issues of intent, recklessness, and negligence. Our laws are often designed, as here in Wisconsin, as enhancers to the underlying crime. Working closely with our partners in the United States Attorney's Office allows us to address the broader issues of unlawful motive. However, I believe that the time has come that our respective states should create a framework for addressing hate crimes and acts of domestic terror in a more comprehensive way, perhaps by authorizing our state attorney generals, as we've heard in Michigan, to commence prosecutions related to violations of civil liberties based on the respective rights in each state constitution. I'll finish by indicating that in 1973, the Berger Commission was addressing similar issues related to of national importance, and Professors Remington and Goldstein from the University of Wisconsin had this to say, quote, "Those in the system must work together through liaison, cooperation, constructive joint effort. It's effective to the operation of the police and the entire criminal justice system. To achieve optimum police effectiveness, the police should be recognized as having complex and multiple tasks to perform, in addition to apprehending people committing serious offenses. Such other tasks include the protection of certain rights, such as to speak and to assemble, participation directly in social agencies and the prevention of criminal and delinquent behavior, the maintenance of order, and assistance to citizens in need, such as those who are mentally ill, the chronic alcoholic, and the drug addict." This was written at a time of social unrest, not wholly dissimilar to our own. Each generation faces its own unique challenges, but we must endeavor to respond in a way that learns both from past failure and past success, and allows future generations the right to expand and enrich upon this unique experiment in democracy by promoting respectful discourse and rejecting violent path to change. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'll provide any assistance requested as you work to address this issue of national importance. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I thank all the witnesses for your testimony. I know we're going to have lots of meaty questions for you. I'll remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. For both our members and our witnesses, there's a little screen that you should see that shows the clock, and I will keep our members to time so that we can efficiently make it through the questions. And I'll recognize myself to start for a 5-minute period. You know, I think it's important to understand for all three of you, for the average American to understand what goes on when there's an incident that might qualify as something like domestic terrorism in your state. What is the process that you go through in determining who will charge that individual, whether it will be you or the federal officials? Kind of walk us through, maybe AG Nessel, if you could start, the nuts and bolts. You know, if you want to speak to the specific plot against our governor, how can the average American understand how we figure out how to prosecute these folks?
Well, first of all, I think that the best way to go about it, and the way that we went about it in regard to the plot involving the governor, was to work in a task force that involved multiple layers and multiple levels. You know, and when we identified that there was this issue, to work together in concert with, you know, the FBI, Michigan State Police, our office, and also with local authorities. So, you know, I think that working together works best for a variety of different reasons, but also, you know, the analysis then for us involved what laws were applicable to what kind of conduct. And that is why you saw, and as we've talked about, we had more cases that were charged by us at the Department of Attorney General at the state level than we had federally. And a big part of that, of course, is because, quite honestly, we did not have the federal laws available in order to I think, properly charge these individuals with the conduct of which they were accused. And the thing that I think is the most astonishing was that the fact that had these individuals, and I should interject that, of course, these individuals are presumed innocent until learned less, found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. But that being the case, just from a sort of a theoretical level, as we're discussing this, had the plot been just to execute the governor, the federal authorities might not have had any charges at all. Had it not involved kidnapping, they would have been unable to charge her, and the state would have had to taken each and every one of the applicable charges and defendants. But that being the case, in terms of having an understanding of the best way to handle it, I really do think it's important that you have all of these different entities working together. And I think that not only does that resolve the issue of who has the best laws and the most applicable laws, but I think it keeps everybody else in check. And as you likely know, obviously I'm a statewide elected official who's a Democrat, but I was working with 2 U.S. attorneys that were Republicans. And of course, then we had the FBI. Of course, the director was a Trump appointee. We had the Michigan State Police that is overseen by our Democratic governor. And I say all this because I think it's just so important that we had those checks and balances in place to make certain that we didn't have any instances where anyone felt as though we were overstepping our bounds or that these prosecutions in any way, shape, or form were politicized. But I think that the most important thing is to ensure that you have a task force that is multi-leveled and that honestly that it's properly resourced. In addition to, as I stated earlier, us having the right laws in place so that we can appropriately investigate and prosecute any set of circumstances that involves harm to the public or harm to public officials or anyone in government.
Great. Go ahead. Does someone want to speak? No. I now recognize Ranking Member Pfluger, the gentleman from Texas, for his 5 minutes of questions. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I appreciate all the witnesses' testimony. Attorney General Ford, a question for you. What tools do you have at the state and local level to charge offenders when they do commit acts of domestic terrorism, such as the 2017 Las Vegas incident or the 2012 incident at the Sikh temple?
Thank you so much for the question, Representative Pfluger. And again, thank you so much, Congressman Slotkin, for having me here. Representative Pfluger, we have, comparable to what Dana Nessel, General Nessel just talked about, the opportunity to coordinate among our state and local and federal officials in instances like that. We have different jurisdictions, if you will, that the public doesn't recognize or even know about. And so the opportunity to discuss who has priority, who has the primary jurisdiction in issues like that is always an important conversation to have. So we have state statutes, for example, that we could have utilized had he survived to charge him with terrorism, for example. But the district attorney at the local level would have had potentially primary jurisdiction for other types of crimes that would have been committed or that could have been charged. And likewise, to the extent there were federal laws that were implicated, the federal agencies could have coordinated and figured out a way to charge him under federal laws. What we have in Southern Nevada is a fusion center. That's what we call it, a fusion center, where all of us are able to talk to among one another and to ascertain who is the best entity, which is the best entity to address which particular instances of concern that we have. And that's in Southern Nevada, but that's also in Northern Nevada. And so in the instance that you talk about in October 1, we were all activated. I wasn't Attorney General at the time. I was actually in the state Senate at the time, but I was also on the Homeland Security Committee in our state. And I understood that there was a lot of coordination taking place to figure out what was going on, because again, we talk about lone wolves. We didn't know there was a lone wolf necessarily at the time. And so trying to figure out which resources were going to be marshaled and going to address this issue was an ongoing conversation at that time.
Well, thank you very much for that. And my question on the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the fusion, I think both the chairwoman and I share the same thought that we want to understand the intelligence that's being passed down. Do you feel like your ability to get intelligence to work with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the Fusion Center is effective? And if not, what would you recommend as changes?
I would say that we could always improve in our communications in that arena. The truth be told, communication and coordination could always be improved. We do have great relationships with our state, local, and federal partners, and the Fusion Center is a great opportunity to have those conversations. But I wouldn't be telling the truth if I were to say that we couldn't improve in that arena. Those communications lines are vitally important when it comes to being able to respond on the ground. Just yesterday, at the government building in Southern Nevada, in Las Vegas, we had what we thought was a bomb threat. Just yesterday, where everybody in our building down in Southern Nevada had to be evacuated. And so being able to coordinate and cooperate in that Fusion Center with information flowing back and forth was vitally important. And we were able to obviously secure the scene and return everybody to the office. But again, it was a test of cooperation, a test of coordination, a test of communication, and we look forward to always trying to improve those.
Well, thank you very much. And again, to all the witnesses, thank you for your testimony today. I think it goes without saying we're committed to making sure that the resources are there to identify these threats before they become an issue. Madam Chairwoman, I do have some questions that I will submit for the record. But with that, I'd like to thank all the witnesses again for being here, their commitment to keeping the country safe, and I yield back.
Great. Thank you, Representative Pfluger. Just to manage expectations, we'll turn in a second to Representative Jackson Lee, then Representative Van Drew, Gottheimer, Meyer, and Malinowski, just to manage expectations. With that, I recognize Representative Jackson Lee. Unless she has stepped away.
Good afternoon.
Good
morning, rather, and thank you to the chairman and ranking member for this important hearing. It complements the work that we're doing in judiciary on the Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security Committee, and I'm delighted to be part of this committee and this focus of this morning. Thank you to all of the witnesses for your presentation. Let me, and your service, because these are very trying and difficult times. Let me quickly start with Attorney General Nessel and refer to Michigan's Anti-Terrorism Act that I believe was passed in the early 2000s, 2002. I would be eager to know the value of that particular statute as you attempted or worked to prosecute the perpetrators who attempted to harm a state official, a government official, an official in essence of the United States serving the state of Michigan. How did you utilize that statute?
Well, the statute has been invaluable, quite honestly. I think it really speaks to the importance of it having been passed. When you say how did we utilize it, we have utilized this in a number of different circumstances. In fact, to follow up on something that AG Ford said, we have a case that's pending right now in terms of an individual that threatened to blow up our state capitol building. And we were able to utilize this particular act in order to charge him. And quite honestly, you know, there are aspects of this law that allow us to prosecute in a litany of different circumstances that, but for this specific act, we either wouldn't be able to charge at all, or we would have to charge very, very minor offenses that I honestly don't think would be fitting for the conduct. Unfortunately, over the course of really just the last year, we've had to charge this in a number of different circumstances, as we've had incidences of domestic terrorism rise exponentially. But, you know, as I indicated earlier, it fits so many different categories of criminal conduct, but it is not overly burdensome, is not overly specific in a way that it hinders us. So, you know, it's been very helpful, and I'd recommend it at the federal level.
Well, in the course of recommending it, have you found in your tenure the misprosecution of individuals who are simply civil rights protesters or Black Lives Matter, or the disparate treatment between what would be militia with the intention to kidnap a governor versus those who are simply protesting. Has that happened?
No, I haven't seen many incidences of that at all. And if you look again at the law, it's pretty specific as to what it involves. But I have not seen it abused. I'm not saying that there are no sets of circumstances under which that could potentially occur. But again, I think that goes back to why I think it's important to have these multi-layered task forces so that we don't see one particular office working alone where you might have intentions that are not always pure. So
Thank you.
But I feel like it's been used well in our state.
Thank you so very much. My time is short. General Ford, very quickly, thank you all for your service, but let me pose to you, as Las Vegas and Nevada has faced so many challenges. Thank you for your leadership. How do we balance having a terrorism initiative on the federal level and making sure that the protection of those who are lawfully protesting, such as a contrast between the treatment of the insurrectionists on January 6th versus the over arresting of those in Washington, D.C. that were Black Lives Matter during the summer of 2020. General Ford?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee. Great to see you again, and thank you so much for that question. It's an important one. And the truth of the matter is we must always balance the rights of individuals with matters of security and safety. We cannot ban all vulgar, derisive, or controversial rhetoric as terrorism, and the U.S. Supreme Court has opined that to prosecute specific conduct or language as being evidence of intimidation or other malevolence, that there must be a real threat. I do have concerns about a bill that would not be narrowly tailored to separate and distinguish between what you indicated as peaceful protesters, as opposed to those who are co-opting their protest and potentially engaging in terroristic acts. And so to the extent there's going to be consideration for a bill in that regard, we have to be conscious of that fact. While General Nessel has indicated that we don't necessarily see that happening relative to her state, we could see it happening. And at the end of the day, we want to be cautious about that and ensure that it doesn't occur. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Attorney General Ford. I now yield to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew. I don't think we're hearing you, Mr. Van Drew, unless that's just me. No.
There you go. Now you can hear me.
There we go. Yes, go ahead.
Good deal. Okay. Someday I'll learn this. I thought I pressed the right button. Thank you, Chairwoman, for having this meeting, and thank you, Ranking Member, as well. I'm going to make this a little personal. I'm curious what all three individuals who are testifying think of this. So on February 28th at my home, I received a voicemail. Actually, my wife did. And the voicemail said, this individual said, and this happens unfortunately to people in Congress, but I will do everything in my power to ensure that you are deposed, if not dead. Anything I can do to get you basically out of office. You are a traitor, Jeff Van Drew, and you deserve the fate of all traitors. He goes on to say, in written that we have before me, he goes on to say, should we, and he speaks about my wife, should we test the acceptability and get the direct response of a prominent GOP female by greeting Van Drew's wife with the Republican high five, putting our hands between her legs, lifting her over the hood of her car, and objectively recording her physical reaction to the tickle when she lands? He then writes, as a traitor, Van Drew has forfeited his right to protection under law. Know this, Jeff Van Drew, it doesn't stop here. God save you. He then goes on to say this is treason, and the penalty for treason is execution. This applies to the great and to the small. He goes on after that to say, should conscientious critics take a cue from the armed rioters, storm his house, smash everything, violate his family, and walk away laughing? Would that be silly? And then finally, and he says a lot of other things, but I won't go into them, we are forced to ponder Thomas Jefferson's grim directive that for the good of our nation, the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of tyrants and traitors. He's very angry, as many people know. I'm a Republican and I used to be a Democrat, which is things that happen in life. What is unusual about this, and I just think everybody would be interested in it, he's a freelance reporter and he writes for a newspaper called the Ocean City Sentinel. And that, everything I read to you except the original death threat was actually in the paper as an op-ed, an opinion editorial, not just a letter to the editor, but opinion editorial. So, of course, we're involved with the police and others and are looking into this. But I'd be curious. I mean, that was very chilling for my wife. I accept that. All of us who are in Congress accept the fact that we are going to go through things like this. It's not acceptable. The bar has been lowered recently. But what I ask is this. Is that acceptable, or is that a form of terrorism to, say, literally threat your family, your children, your grandchildren, your wife, and to say that you're going to sexually assault her? Is that, and that you're of course going to kill me, and that all the political speak about tyrants, is that acceptable? Is that something, because evidently it's not, from what I understand from attorneys. I wanted your thoughts on it. Whoever wants to start.
Well, Representative, I'd be happy to start because I've actually prosecuted a number of cases in our state that are similar to what you just suggested. Now, any constituent, anyone at all, is free to disagree with your policies or your vote, and they can let you know that they don't approve of the way that you conduct yourself in office. But what they cannot do is threaten you or your family with physical harm or death. And whether you do that to your neighbor that lives next door, or whether you do it to an elected official, it's illegal. So in our state, what I've been doing is we have a particular statute that involves using an electronic device to, in order to threaten an individual. So whether that's by telephone or, text message, if you post it on social media or it's an email, that is a crime. I've charged it over and over again, involving a number of public officials, all the way from, President Biden to Representative Slotkin to a judge that is on our Court of Claims, to a Republican member of our state house. So we have been very aggressive in terms of making sure that people understand the difference between what is acceptable First Amendment protected activity and what is a crime. And the sorts of threats that you and your family received, in my opinion, that is criminal conduct. It is illegal. And if you were in my state, I would prosecute.
Yeah, and Mr. Andrew, if I could.
I'm so sorry. We're going to have to leave it at that. We have a strict rule of 5 minutes here. I apologize.
Thank you. Thank you for the information.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the other gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, if he's available. Oh, I'm sorry. Now that I see that Mr. Langevin is jumping on, Mr. Langevin, we yield to you for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. And let me just start, if I could, with Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford, and I apologize, it's already been covered, but the Homeland Security threat assessment specifically notes that white supremacist extremists are engaged in outreach and networking opportunities abroad. What is the process for notifying and working with federal law enforcement if someone you know or suspect to be a white supremacist extremist seeks out connections abroad?
Thank you so much for your question, sir. Aaron Ford, for the record. What I indicated in a couple of responses ago was that the public doesn't really recognize or know about our different jurisdictions, for example. And so we operate under what we call 5 C's in my office, and one of those C's is community outreach and community engagement. And so in client services, and when we receive a complaint, if it's not within our jurisdiction, we can relay that to the appropriate entities, and we utilize the Fusion Center for communications of that sort. So the bottom line is, if there's ever a concern, if you quote unquote see something, you should say something. You can always reach out to my office, and we will find out where that type of information needs to be directed to.
How do you think international coordination changed the threat posed by these groups?
I missed the first part of the question.
Yes, how does international coordination, how do you think it changes the threat posed by these groups?
Well, I do think that it presents a unique problem. You know, at the federal level, terrorism is defined a lot less broadly, if you will. And so internationally, we're able to utilize a definition of terrorism that is different than what we use from the domestic terrorism perspective. And so the Joint Terrorism Task Force is limited in that regard and can oftentimes present problems and issues and roadblocks for us being able to address those issues. But again, through communications through, for example, the Fusion Center and other joint task forces, we're able to have those communications and ascertain which entities are the right ones to address particular issues.
Okay. And let me just say this. You know, I applaud your efforts as law enforcement officers. You know, the second best way to prevent crime is from would maintain law and order and is to obviously to catch and prosecute criminals. But the best way is to prevent crime from ever happening in the first place. So I'd like to focus on the root causes and solutions to domestic extremism that leads to criminal acts and outright terrorism. So, Mr. Ford, in your written statement, you rightly emphasize community engagement to build the social and cultural bonds that unite us and dissolve divisions that stem from unwarranted fears and apprehensions about fellow Americans. So I have two questions for you. First of all, what works? How do you rigorously measure whether community efforts are working? And what are the barriers to doing more of what works best?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, as you've indicated, that coordination, cooperation is very important, and you know, there are probably several responses to that, some of which are best practices, others of which are hit and miss. And I think the actual effort of engaging in the communities and having conversations with folks and trying to improve the relationships between law enforcement and the communities that they serve oftentimes can lead to us being able to address domestic terrorism to the extent that we're able to learn about it, right, through those conversations and through those communications. We have seen, for example, instances where individuals have been seen walking through neighborhoods with AR-15s and then subsequently months later ultimately prosecuted because they were in fact a domestic terrorist attempting to do something bad on our strip. That has happened, and so that comes through community coordination, cooperation, and communication. And I think that's part and parcel with to addressing this problem.
Okay, very good. And the little bit of time I have left, Mr. Chisholm, what are the enablers and barriers to diffusing extremist and violent tendencies in your state or county? What authorities, resources, constraints, and requirements from the federal government are most helpful or harmful? And what do you need more of or less of?
Very briefly, please.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Representative. We actually have benefited tremendously from a close relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the federal government, providing us resources to enact programs like community-based prosecution, where we actually take experienced people from our office, place them in neighborhoods, and develop a different type of relationship. Also focusing on victims of crime and addressing the trauma issues is, in my view, absolutely critical. In other words, when we respond to massive events like this, it is really my office that has the personnel and experience to deal with the immediate effects of the trauma, that those are individuals and their families that have now been exposed to violence. And we do need more resources to be able to address those issues with the view of
We're going to have to leave it there. I apologize, sir. We're going to have to leave it there. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you all of the other witnesses who have joined us here today. You know, at a first full committee hearing, as the Representative Slotkin mentioned, we meant to evaluate the threat of domestic terrorism following the events of January 6th. And the questions I asked were mainly on how we can shift away from the reactive approach that I think we've all too often seen, especially when grappling with the magnitude of the issue, and how we can be a bit more targeted on the front end so that we're addressing some of those underlying levers. And instead of just constantly creating new agencies, offices, programs, how can we better use existing capabilities in order to ensure that we're instituting reforms that target threats appropriately while measuring the effectiveness of those relative approaches. So that was one of the reasons why this week I joined my colleague on this panel, Mr. Malinowski, in calling for additional funding for DHS's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, or TVTP, and its corresponding grant program. So that office provides technical, financial, and educational assistance to stakeholders to establish and expand local prevention networks, help the department combat all forms of violence, regardless of ideological motivation, but specifically to award funds on a competitive basis to states, local, tribal, and territorial governments, nonprofits, and institutions of higher education to establish those sustainable prevention capabilities. And the word that I think I never want us to forget, because it's the way that we avoid this just becoming a defensive partisan exercise, is violence. The word extremism gets thrown around a lot, but where our focus and where our issue is when that violent nexus, when that violent act is in the process or is planning to occur. And as Representative Slotkin has mentioned, that's something we saw in our home state of Michigan. It's something that we experienced during the assaults on the Capitol itself. It's where the First Amendment protections fall away because that has entered into a criminal act, a criminal behavior. And how can we ensure that we are appropriately mitigating while having the corresponding respect for civil rights and civil liberties? So on that note, Attorney General Nessel, I want to ask about your experiences with these challenges in our home state of Michigan. Obviously, you mentioned the Wolverine Watchman. We've talked about some of those specific threats and a legacy that goes back, over 30 years. But do you feel the role of DHS and the federal government in combating these kinds of violence? How have you found that cooperation to be to date? I know you touched upon fusion cells, fusion centers in a prior question, but just wanted to get your broad approach on how you feel that federal cooperation has been so far.
Sorry. Certainly I think we had great cooperation as it pertained to that particular set of circumstances, and that we worked very well together at that juncture. Like AG Ford, I will tell you that's not always the case. And being someone who, before I came to state government, I worked for a county prosecutor's office, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. We often had a lot of complaints about the coordination between the county level and the state level, and then the state level and the federal level. So we can always do better when it comes to that. Now, in terms of the DHS Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention grants, let me say this. That money, as you know, is for prevention, not for prosecution. From my perspective, what's needed to support the Michigan State Police and my office, and for MSP, intelligence sharing, really, between local police and MSP is really the greatest weakness, I think. Now, of course, MSP has fusion centers, but outreach and education to local law enforcement is badly needed so they can identify intelligence that really should be shared. And, sometimes the locals fail to properly assess and identify risk factors like individual behavior of local extremists at the early stages, so that it can be passed up so that we can evaluate whether this is a person who is truly inherently dangerous. Now,
I'm just going to reclaim a minute of my time. I know I'm running short, but I just wanted to clarify. You get the sense from speaking with local law enforcement and even state partners that they feel it's a one-way information flow, that they're feeding information up, but not necessarily having that be reciprocated by the federal government?
I do sometimes get that from them, but I will say this, that lack of information flow goes both ways. And I've had several circumstances where we have cases that we will get it when it gets to a certain level, and we'll find out later on that there were indicators that an individual was dangerous and had aberrant behavior that one would think would lead to something more dangerous later, but we just never found out about it because nobody passed it up to us. And had we known about it to begin with, we could have prosecuted something, perhaps, even a lower level misdemeanor, but it would have put this person, under the guidance of the court, so that whether it's a mental health related issue or some other issue, that could be addressed before it turned into something much more dangerous. So at all levels, I think we are failing to some extent.
Thank you, Attorney General. Madam Chair, you're back.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The chair recognizes the member from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I've unfortunately been in and out, so I may have missed a couple of the questions and answers, but I did want to make sure that I understood as best I can what the witnesses' advice and recommendations on the DHS targeted violence prevention grants. And so I wanted to ask whether you all have had specific experience with the program over the last 3 years. It was in operation and then virtually shut down in 2017, restarted last year. We're looking potentially at a significant increase in funding. And so I'm wondering if any of you can share experiences with what has worked and what hasn't in the past in that program. And I'm sorry if that's repetitive of something I missed.
Well, this is Aaron Ford for the record. I'm not certain that I can speak specifically to that program, but what I can say, sir, is that federal funding is critical to the state's ability to respond to and to recover from mass violence or domestic terrorism events. The way an incident is defined in law has an impact on how our response and recovery can be funded. In fact, after October 1, 2017, the Nevada Department of Health and Human Services received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice Anti-Terrorism Emergency Assistance Program, which was utilized for law enforcement overtime needed to respond to that event, as well as mental health treatment for October 1 survivors. It's unclear whether Nevada will qualify for funding under the Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, because that definition of major disaster is very restrictive. And so, looking at these forms of definitions and programs, I think is an important component to discussing actual responses to domestic terroristic and domestic violence events, domestic extremism events.
Okay, understood. Anybody else wants to chime in? Yeah.
If I can say, and I think it's an important question, and for the purposes of my department, I will say, first of all, we just haven't had a lot of contact at all in regard to these grants. But what we need at our department, quite honestly, is we need resources that go directly to the Michigan Department of Attorney General. We need money for analysts, we need money for investigators, and we need money for additional prosecutors. I'll be honest with you, we were getting so many threats. We ended up partnering with a college, Fair State University. They have a cybersecurity program. We're actually having to work with undergraduate students right now to help us track threats. And we have an MOU with them that we just put together, partially because we don't have the funding available to do this on our own. We have so few investigators in our office that are not on specific funding tracks that would not even allow them to do this kind of work, even if we could reassign them. We're not permitted to by law. So we need help. We need finances. And for us to be able to do our job, we just need more in the way of funding, because the problem is greater than ever, and it's going to involve more resources than ever.
Understood. Just shifting the subject in my remaining time, one of the issues that I've been really focused on is the role that social media platforms and their algorithms play in connecting vulnerable, susceptible individuals to extremist groups and making that initial connection. And there was a really fascinating case actually in Michigan that I read about recently in the local press in Michigan, about a guy who turned out to be an FBI informant, having joined the Wolverine militia. And he said in an interview that he joined the group because it was recommended to him by Facebook. He'd been scrolling through pro-gun pages, basically Second Amendment pages, and they recommended he join it. And I guess here's the way I would pose it to you, Attorney General. Imagine you heard that somebody in your state was doing that, just looking at gun rights pages, and the next day a Facebook executive called him on the phone to say, hey, couldn't help but notice that you were interested in the Second Amendment, and we've got this really, really wonderful, neat organization we think you might be interested in, and so we want to send you their phone number and email address and contact info so that you can have a meaningful experience with the Wolverine militia. How would you feel that Facebook was at least morally responsible for the consequences of that kind of action?
Very, very briefly, please, 15 seconds.
Yes.
Good enough. Thank you so much. I go back.
Thank you, Attorney General Nessel, for being so concise. The chair now recognizes Representative Green. Representative Green, over to you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I greatly appreciate the extension of this opportunity. I'm an interloper, and an interloper who did not register himself properly. So I do humbly apologize to you and appreciate your graciousness. My question will be a very simple one for anyone who'd like to help me. I plan to visit the border in El Paso this weekend, and my concerns are many, but I'd like to know from the point of view of people who are on the ground there, what should I look for? What is important for me to see and to understand so that I may better negotiate legislation in the Congress? And whichever person would like to be first to answer, I'll be more than honored to hear your response.
Why don't we start with Representative Mr. Chisholm, then Mr. Ford, then Ms. Nessel.
Thank you, Representative Green.